Breeze's massive rework has been out for a few days, so let's go over which agents are going to be the best on this map. I'll mostly try and focus on the map itself and how well certain pieces of utility are just going to fit in the space that we're working with, but having said that, the meta at the moment is also going to play a factor as well. So with that in mind, let's start off with the controller class, and in theory, Clove is the worst controller for Breeze. When you're on defense as Clove, it is straight up impossible to smoke both sides. Even if you play from around nest, it's simply going to take you too long to rotate and be within range of particularly a main. On top of that, their smokes are the shortest in duration, and there's just not much stopping power in Clove's kit either. Now having said all of that, Clove is still an absolute monster in ranked, and you'll probably do quite well just forcing them on any map, but I do think that Breeze will punish you the hardest with your lack of range. Fittingly, I've got Brimstone next because he faces a very similar problem to Clove, being that the range in his smokes is just as limited. Of course, he has insane post-plant with the molly and ultimate, but even with all of the changes to Breeze, those abilities still aren't just that well suited for such a big map. You can probably still get away with playing him and just running it down, dropping all 3 smokes and sending it onto site, but personally I wouldn't. Even though Harbor is pretty weak right now, I actually really like how his smokes feel on Breeze. Obviously his wall is always going to be good at slicing through the map and blocking off multiple angles at once, but his new and improved Cove is actually really useful for getting mid control as a solo controller while still being able to properly execute on site. His ult is going to be a little bit tough to hit sites with, especially A site feels like you can never really clear that many corners or things with it, but I do think his Storm Surge also has a bit more merit with its ability to go through walls now. So while I probably wouldn't recommend you rush out and insta-lock Harbor and Breeze, I do think this is one of the better maps for his design. Now we've got Astra, and I do really love her on Breeze after the changes. Personally, that's my go-to pick at the moment, but I wouldn't recommend playing her if you don't already, since she is kind of hard to pick up. If you are good at Astra though, she's really able to flex her global presence here on such a big map, and the changes to improve controller viability have worked really well in her favor. So of course her dome smokes are now just going to fit nicer towards both sides, and then her wall is still going to feel nice here as well, given there are those bigger areas you can block off all at once. Again, I honestly think her only downfall is just going to be that she's hard to play and make work in ranked. And that is basically the only reason that I have Omen ranked above Astra. I do think this flash towards the left side of B side looks really good when attacking, although again on A, like a lot of these straight line skill shot abilities, you might find it a bit harder to get value out of. While his smoke range isn't quite global, it is good enough to cover both sides from mid, and there are still some boxes and things you can get on top of which people might not be expecting. Also, one thing I noticed that only Harbor and Omen can do with the way they place their smokes is consistently smoke off this archway to the back of B side. Any other controller sort of has to commit to a side or make the smoke awkward, whereas these two have no problems, so I thought that was worth mentioning. Finally, we have Viper, who is still the best controller on Breeze. She might not be an absolute necessity anymore, and you can definitely play other controllers with more confidence now, but none of that outright takes away from her power. You should definitely look to use your orb mid in order to block off whichever of these 3 choke points is appropriate, and then just use your wall for sight. On defense, there's still this classic wall that's going to work well towards A and mid, and while I do think that Viper is in a weird state for ranked at the moment after all these nerfs that she's been getting, I think especially on Breeze where she's still a comfort pick for a lot of people and people like playing her there, she's actually going to be a pretty safe pick to lock in. Unlike other maps, you won't need to rely on a second controller to take sites and have more map control, as her wall is still able to slice off the same spots you would want dome smokes anyway. So those are all 6 of the controllers and how I would rank them. Again, I will make a point of saying if you love playing Clove or Brimstone, don't feel discouraged, you can definitely make them work. You might just struggle to be there for your teammates on defense. Personally, I'm going to be playing Astra, but Omen players should find a lot of success on the new Breeze, even though Viper and her wall are probably going to reign supreme. Moving on to the initiators now, and up first I've got Breach, who is always going to struggle on such a big and open map. They did make some changes to create new corners and things like that, which in theory he can flush out, but I think that there is simply just too much for him to clear out to be successful, especially as a solo initiator. This is a pretty terrible map to be having no information gathering on your team for, so Breach is definitely pretty far down the priority list in terms of which initiators you want on your team. Then I've actually got Tejo, who is also going to have a similar problem on Breeze. He does at the very least have his drone, but especially after the range reduction on this and combined with how limited his vision already is, simply can't clear as much as some of the other initiators. Just like some of the other iPad agents, the range limit on his salvos is also going to hurt on Breeze, and while I'm sure there are still some areas you can successfully clear out, I don't think he's going to be completely useless here. I just think that there are better options. Next, barely scraping by those two but in the same tier, I have Gekko. Meta-wise, he's in a really rough place at the moment, but on Breeze, I do think that having Wingman plant the spike for you is going to be pretty handy. You'll always get some value out of Dizzy by just throwing him out and clearing close, potentially blinding people, And then of course, Thrash is just a really solid drone with a powerful debuff for the enemy. Like I keep saying, since Breeze is such a big and wide map, still you mightn't be able to consistently pick up your utility again, which is why he prefers maps like Bind or even Lotus, but I don't think that Gekko is the worst option on Breeze. Moving on to KO now, I mean, I'm never going to recommend him because he always seems to have bad stats in ranked, but historically Breeze has been an okay map for him. He isn't limited by range like some of the other initiators, so you can get some nice cross-map utility for your teammates, and on defense you will pretty easily be able to get these big knives on the enemy right as they're about to rush side. At the end of the day, KO is still going to suffer from a lack of overall information compared to some of the better initiators on Breeze, so as good as his flashes can be, I personally would be picking some of the other agents over him. Speaking of, I actually think that Fade isn't too bad on Breeze now after these changes. Even though typically a bigger and more open map doesn't sound ideal for her, you can pretty easily clear close with just one prowler, and then both her C's and I will actually have some pretty good spots if you just chuck them backside. If you're tossing up between Sova and Fade and are better at Sova, I would definitely take him, and I'll explain more on that later. But if you are more comfortable on Fade, she's not going to be terrible here. In between those two recon agents though, I actually have Skye, who I feel like is climbing up the ranks again after all the nerfs to the other initiators not too long ago. She is a solid jack of all trades initiator with both flashes and information, and so that ends up being handy when your team comp needs both a drone and a flash. The range on her dog is somewhat limited, similar to Tejo, but she has other tools in her kit to find enemies who are lurking around towards backside. Finally though, to hopefully no one's surprise, Sova is still going to be a super strong initiator on Breeze. His drone is crucial in finding out where those inevitable operators are posted up, and on such a wide open map, there are endless places and lineups you can find for his recon bolt and even shock dart too. Especially considering you're more likely to be seeing smaller traps like ciphers or chambers as opposed to, a whole sage wall or deadlock wall, those shock darts are going to be especially useful to take those out from anywhere. Sova's ultimate is always going to be strong for post plant too, but especially on Breeze you can get so far back and out of the defender's way to secure the round win. So that wraps up the initiators. Honestly, I think I'll find myself playing Skye the most, just because she brings a lot of different utility, and also since my server is pretty weak. I think in general, as long as your focus is on information initiators rather than flushing initiators, you'll do pretty well. Let's talk about the Sentinels now, and this map has always been a struggle for Killjoy considering how big it is, and the changes unfortunately don't do enough to fix that. Her lockdown honestly feels hopeless for both attacking and retaking sites. No matter where you place it down, there's always going to be gaps for the enemy to work in. I don't really see a world where you'd pick KJ over some of the other wider range Sentinels, or if you just really want to lock down a side instead, then pick any of Deadlock, Sage or Vyse. I will say next though that Deadlock is also going to struggle a fair bit on Breeze, mostly due to her lack of information. There are definitely some places that you can get value out of her sonic sensors, but considering how big the sites still are, I think that makes the actual good positions for this ability a little bit too predictable. Then the wall feels rough to use defending B with this elevation change on the stairs and stuff like that, but maybe if you get creative with it, you can force them into your trips. Now, Vyse actually hasn't been in the game since Breeze was last removed, and I think it's going to be a little bit of a rough map for her. Just like I said with Killjoy's ultimate, you're going to struggle to find any value here considering Vyse's ultimate is even like 5 meters smaller than that, but I do think there's good value in her wall not being too limited by range, and her thorns actually do a surprisingly good job at covering the site. Then while her flash is in a rough spot after the nerfs late last year, I do think if you're creative with it, you can find some good enough spots. Then right after that I have Sage, who is similar to Deadlock and will struggle here a little bit with her lack of passive information. To make up for that, she does have a little bit more guaranteed value in her kit, and then both their heal and res are always going to be good in ranked. Her slows are going to be a lot more reliable to block off choke points for longer periods of time, unlike something like Deadlock sound sensors, which can just be broken. There's also this crazy spot on B which you can use her wall from. Some people think that this needs to be hotfixed, but for now at least it's still in the game. I think Cypher has had a bit of a fall from grace in terms of popularity on Breeze, but that's mostly due to his balance changes and place in the meta, rather than these actual map changes. As much as Cypher loved lurking and making his way through holes, the removal of holes allows him to use both troops on site, which can definitely be seen as a good thing. On top of that, his cage is going to be pretty handy in mid, especially if you are just running one of the standard dome smokers. This way you can just use your cage to easily cross and mid split into A, and then your Astra or Omen can save both their smokes for either side of yellow. I actually have Veto next, and just like Vyse, he never got to see Breeze since he's the newest agent added to the game. I do think that he's a decent pick here, but I'm trying not to be too biased as someone who enjoys playing him a lot. I just can't see how he's bad on such a big map where you're able to cover so much ground with his teleports. The one thing I did notice while mucking around in customs is that, unlike some of the other maps, it felt quite difficult to find a really good spot for his interceptor, but outside of that, you still have solid flank watch and a fun ultimate, so what's not to love here? Finally though, for the Sentinels, I mean, you already know who it is. Chamber is already popular and ranked, and then Breeze is just made for him. The long open sightlines are perfect for AWPing, and then his trip just has one less thing to worry about now with the removal of halls. Originally, you'd normally stick your chamber there for half the rounds, so I honestly think its removal was a net positive for him. And since Breeze's original removal, he's actually gotten the range restriction on his trap taken away. And this, out of all maps, is probably where you would notice that the most. So, especially if you're competent with the operator, Chamber is going to be an incredible pick on Breeze. So all in all, I think in almost every game you're probably going to have a Chamber here, and for good reason too. This map felt like it used to be a battle between Cypher and Chamber for pick rate, so now that one of those two got buffed and the other got nerfed, it leaves us with a pretty obvious option. Last but not least, we have the duelists, and I definitely think that Waylay is a weak pick here. I think it's just hard for her to find value on such an open map, especially her ultimate just feels a little bit too thin to debuff enough of the side. On top of that, just like I said last time when I talked about her in one of these videos, she's going to be sort of hard for solo queue anyway, and I just wouldn't really recommend playing her here. After that, we've got Raze, who traditionally has been pretty weak on Breeze, and even with the map updates, I don't think too much changes. I will say that removing some of the verticality and locking it behind movement abilities does give you a chance to get in some otherwise unexpected positions, but there are definitely better agents for that. Otherwise, there aren't enough areas for her boombot to get a ton of value, and then the nade and the ultimate, again, they're just going to struggle on an open map. After that, I've got Neon, who I actually think is pretty good on Breeze, and she's all the way up in the A tier despite still being behind some of the other duelists. Her sprint is going to allow her to rotate faster than most, which obviously is going to be important on Breeze, and then the wall allows her to slice up these big open sites into more digestible areas. The stun, you might struggle to hit two important angles with it, and instead might just have to focus on one, but then her ultimate can just never really be bad here, so I think you'll have a decent amount of success if you just want to run it down on Neon. I'll talk about Reyna for a moment. I mean, she's almost never going to be map dependent, but there is a tiny bit more merit to her flash than usual given it has no range limit. We all know how popular Reyna is, and the style of agent she is just makes her more viable if you're going to be fragging out and getting kills, making the most out of the heal and dismiss. Not much else to say there. If you're getting a lot of kills, Reyna's great on Breeze. I've actually got Phoenix next, who is never really a bad pick in ranked, and I think he's even slightly above average on Breeze. Especially this A orb is super easy for the attackers to farm, so you can generate a lot of ultimates pretty easily through that. His wall can normally block off at least one of the angles as he takes sight, so there's that. And otherwise, I mean, his flash is good, he's pretty strong and self-sufficient. I don't think you can go wrong with playing Phoenix. Cracking into the top 3, Jett has always been a staple pick on Breeze, and I don't think enough has changed to make her bad here. Similar to Chamber, she loves AWPing, and such a long range map is obviously going to be perfect for that, and then her knives are nice here as well if you're good enough with them. I don't think it's ever going to be bad to dash out onto the side in the safety of your smoke, and especially since so many players are comfortable on Jett, you're going to see her a lot on this map, and rightfully so. One step above that though, I do actually have ISO, as he's going to be a really solid pick on Breeze, considering how many operators you're going to see here, and obviously his kit is almost perfect for countering them. Whether it's his ultimate, shield, or wall, you can always deny the opportunity for that first pick. His wall in particular I like here too, since you'll pretty easily be able to deny some of the angles, as well as some of those close crossfires as well. I think the only ability I don't immediately see free value in is the undercut, but if the other team has a Sova, you can just play close and try to deny his drone. Now the only pick better than ISO on Breeze I think is going to be Yoru, and even though he's hard to play and not for everyone, I think the amount of value that you can get out of him makes it worth learning. He's still going to be a solid pseudo initiator with the flashes and his ultimate, but most importantly you can get insane value out of his teleports on such a big map. Honestly, Breeze coming back makes me regret not investing more time into Yoru so I could abuse him here. So those are all the duelists. Obviously you are always going to see Jett and Reyna in ranked regardless, but this is probably one of the better maps for both of them. So those two are good, but I do still think that both ISO and Yoru are a little bit stronger and better suited to Breeze for a variety of reasons. Overall, my agent tier list for Breeze ends up looking something like this, but let me know what you would change in the comments.